Imagine being erased from history, your achievements stolen, your legacy buried. But what if you got a second chance to expose the truth? A legendary pilot, a buried conspiracy, and a man who was never meant to survive. This is the story of Maverick Gaines, the ghost who came back to haunt those who tried to erase him. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you listening from? What time is it for you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The wrench slipped from Mac's fingers, clanging against the concrete floor of the hangar. He cursed under his breath, shaking out his sore hands. The cold metal had numbed his fingers, but that wasn't the only reason for his frustration. He wasn't supposed to be here, stooped over an old commercial aircraft, oil staining his coveralls. Once, Maverick Mac Gaines had ruled the skies. Now he spent his days fixing planes he'd once dreamed of flying. A radio hummed in the background, the tinny voice of a news anchor drifting through the garage. Mac barely listened, his mind elsewhere, lost in the rhythm of tightening bolts and checking fuel lines. But then, a word caught his ear, something he hadn't heard in years. Edwards Air Force Base has announced a commemorative ceremony honoring test pilots from the 1950s. Mac froze. His pulse drummed in his ears. The ceremony. It was supposed to be for men like him. Men who had risked everything, pushing the limits of what was possible. But he knew his name wouldn't be on that list. He'd been erased. "Hey, old man, you gonna stare at that plane all day or finish the job?" Mac turned to see Randy, a younger mechanic with a cocky grin, leaning against the toolbox. The kid had been needling him since day one, calling him Grandpa and questioning whether he even remembered how to hold a wrench. Mac exhaled slowly, ignoring the remark. "Plane's fine," he muttered, wiping grease off his hands. "You'll be thanking me when this thing doesn't fall out of the sky." Randy scoffed, shaking his head. Yeah. Back in your day, huh? Must have been a hell of a time." Mac didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Outside, the crisp Los Angeles air hit him, the scent of jet fuel lingering from the runways nearby. He leaned against his old Buick, staring up at the evening sky. Once, that sky had belonged to him. Now it felt impossibly far away. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet. Inside, tucked behind a few worn bills, was an old photograph, creased at the edges, the ink slightly faded. It showed him, young and sharp-eyed, standing beside his aircraft. The uniform crisp. The name patch bold. Lieutenant Maverick Gaines. No one remembered him. No one even spoke his name anymore. But then something unexpected happened. When he slid into the driver's seat, he noticed an envelope sitting on the dashboard. No stamp, no return address, just his name, his full name. Hands steady but heart pounding, Mac tore it open. Inside was a cassette tape and a single scrap of paper. 3 words were scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. "You were right." Mac frowned. His gaze drifted to the tape, fingers tracing its rough plastic edges. It had been decades since he'd heard those words, since he'd let himself believe them. His gut told him to throw it away, to pretend he never saw it. Instead, he started the car and drove home, the tape clutched tight in his fist. That night, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, he slid the cassette into an old player, pressing play with a hesitant finger. Static crackled first, then a voice, muffled, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. This wasn't a mistake. The plane was sabotaged. It was never supposed to fly. Mac sat up, his breath caught in his throat. Then a second voice, sharper, controlled. "Reeves will handle it. We'll make sure he disappears for good." Mac's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. Reeves. It had been decades since he'd heard that name. The tape hissed, then cut off. Mac didn't move for a long time. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The past wasn't dead. It had been waiting, and now it was knocking at his door. Mac sat in silence, the cassette player still humming softly as the tape came to an end. His hands were stiff around the armrests, his mind whirring. He had spent years forcing himself to forget, convincing himself that what happened at Anderson Airfield was just another unfortunate accident, a footnote in history. But now, someone was telling him he had been right all along. He rewound the tape, pressing play again. This wasn't a mistake. The plane was sabotaged. It was never supposed to fly. The voice was distorted, but the words were unmistakable. Mac clenched his jaw as the second voice cut in. Reeves will handle it. We'll make sure he disappears for good. Colton Reeves. The name made his stomach turn. Mac forced himself to take a slow breath, but it did little to steady the fire rising in his chest. Reeves had been his superior officer, his commanding officer during the flight tests. He was the one who had declared the crash an unfortunate technical failure, the one who had made sure there was no investigation, the one who had signed his death certificate. Mac had always suspected foul play, but the years had buried his doubts under the weight of survival. What choice had he had? After the crash, he had been told to move on, that the program was shut down, that his career was over. His name had been erased from the records, and no one had been willing to listen. But now someone wanted him to know the truth. Someone had risked their life to get this to him. Max stared at the tape, his hands tightening into fists. If what he heard was true, then this wasn't just about him. Others had been involved. Others had died. He had to find out who sent this, and he knew exactly where to start. The next morning, Mac drove down a street he hadn't seen in years. The Eagle's Nest, a worn-out bar tucked between a used tire shop and a pawn store, looked exactly the same. The neon sign flickered, the paint peeling off the edges. Mac stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. The place smelled of old leather and cheap whiskey. The same dusty photographs lined the walls, faces of men who had flown, fought, and faded into history. A few regulars sat hunched over their drinks, lost in their own ghosts. Behind the bar, a familiar figure was polishing a glass. Elias Eli Novak. Mac hadn't seen him in over a decade, but the man looked just as he remembered, grizzled, with deep lines carving his face, his once dark hair now streaked with silver. For a moment, Eli just stared at him, then let out a dry chuckle. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Thought you were a ghost. Mac pulled up a stool. Not yet. Eli poured a drink without asking, sliding it across the bar. You still drink bourbon? Mac nodded but didn't touch the glass. I need answers, Eli. Eli exhaled through his nose, setting the glass he was cleaning down with a quiet thunk. You don't want to dig that up, Mac. I don't have a choice. Mac pulled the tape from his pocket, setting it on the bar. Someone sent me this. Someone who knows what really happened. Eli's fingers twitched. He didn't reach for the tape, but Mac saw the recognition in his eyes. You ever hear the name Reeves again after all these years? Mac pressed. Eli's jaw tightened. He's still out there, he muttered, more powerful than ever. Mac wasn't surprised. Men like Reeves didn't just disappear. They climbed higher, buried their sins under medals and promotions. Tell me the truth, Eli. His voice was steady, but his grip on the glass was white-knuckled. Did they sabotage my plane? Eli hesitated, glancing around the bar. Then quietly, yes. The word hit Mac like a punch to the gut. It was bigger than just you, Eli continued, voice low. They were testing something, a new propulsion system, but it was unstable. When you started asking questions, they knew they couldn't let you live. You were supposed to die in that crash, Mac, but somehow you didn't. Mac swallowed, his throat dry. They erased me. They did more than that, Eli said grimly. They erased a lot of people, and if you go poking around, they'll make sure you disappear for real this time. Mac's hands curled into fists. I spent my whole life thinking I was just another accident, he said, voice tight with anger. Now I find out I was a loose end they forgot to tie up. Eli sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. If you really want answers, there's only one person who can give them to you. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Reeves. Mac had already known that. He just hadn't been ready to say it out loud. You planning on knocking on his front door? Eli asked, skeptical. Something like that, Mac said. Eli scoffed. That bastard lives in a fortress. You won't get anywhere near him. Mac pushed away from the bar, grabbing the tape. Then I'll find another way. Eli watched him for a long moment, then sighed. You're just as stubborn as ever. Mac stood. You know where to find me if you change your mind. Eli hesitated, then said something that made Mac pause mid-step. Just Be careful. People who dig up the past don't always like what they find. Mac glanced over his shoulder. Yeah, he murmured, but I've been dead once before. He stepped out into the sunlight, his mind set. It was time to face the man who had stolen his life. Mac drove in silence, the hum of the engine a steady companion to the thoughts racing through his head. Reeves. The name alone was enough to stir something cold and bitter in his chest. The man had once controlled his fate, had written him off as collateral damage. And now, decades later, Mac was still here, still breathing, still holding on to the truth that should have died with him. But if Reeves was still out there, living comfortably in the shadows, then this wasn't just about the past. It was about everything the man had done since then. Mac pulled up to a stretch of abandoned road outside of town, killing the engine. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The air smelled of dry grass and distant asphalt. He stepped out, boots crunching against the dirt, and took in the sight before him. Anderson Airfield, or what was left of it. The once bustling test site had been shut down years ago. Now all that remained were empty hangars, rusting fences, and a sky that had long forgotten the sound of roaring jet engines. Mac walked toward the chain-link fence, gripping it with both hands. This place had been his proving ground, the place where he had defied expectations, pushing himself and his aircraft beyond their limits. He could still feel the vibrations of the cockpit, the deafening roar of the engines, the rush of adrenaline as he climbed higher and faster than anyone thought possible. And then, the crash, the moment everything changed. Mac forced the memory down. He wasn't here to dwell on the past. He was here to find answers. He circled the perimeter, searching for a way inside. The fence was rusted in places, sections curling up where time had worn it down. He found a weak spot, pushed it aside, and slipped through. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Wind howled through broken windows, sending loose debris skittering across the ground. The main hangar loomed ahead, its massive doors slightly ajar. Max stepped inside, his footsteps echoing. The place had been gutted, workbenches overturned, equipment long since scavenged or abandoned. But something about it still felt familiar. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, scanning the walls. Then he saw it, an old bulletin board, yellowed paper still pinned to it. He moved closer, running his fingers over the faded documents. Flight schedules, test pilot rosters, and then, near the bottom, a name. His name. Mac's heart pounded. His name shouldn't be here. According to official records, he had never existed. He yanked the paper free, scanning the details. Flight Z-91, March 14th, 1953. Test pilot, Lieutenant, Maverick Gaines. Status, classified. His fingers tightened around the paper. Classified. That meant someone had covered it up, buried it deep where no one would ever look. And if they had hidden this, what else had they hidden? Behind him a sound, a soft click. Mac froze. He wasn't alone. In an instant, he spun, dropping low as a shadow moved near the entrance. A figure stepped into the light, a pistol glinting in their grip. Mac didn't hesitate. Years of instinct took over. He lunged, grabbing the wrist, holding the gun and twisting hard. The weapon clattered to the ground. The intruder gasped, stumbling back. Mac caught a glimpse of a face, male, younger, wide-eyed with fear. "Who sent you?" Mac growled, shoving him against the wall. I'm not here to hurt you," the man gasped. "I swear." Mac narrowed his eyes. "Then why the hell are you pointing a gun at me?" The man swallowed hard. "I was told to watch this place, to make sure no one came looking." Mac's grip tightened. "Who told you?" The man hesitated. Mac leaned in. "I don't have patience for games, kid." A flicker of fear crossed the man's face. Then, barely above a whisper, "Reeves." Mac felt his blood run cold. "He's watching," the man continued. "He knows someone's digging. And if you keep pushing, he'll come for you too." Mac stared at him for a long moment, then slowly released his grip. The man coughed, rubbing his throat. "Get out of here," Mac muttered. The man didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his gun, stuffing it into his jacket, and bolted. Mac watched him disappear into the night, his mind already racing. Reeves knew. The man who had stolen his future, the man who had written him off as dead, was still out there, watching, waiting. Mac exhaled slowly, looking down at the crumpled paper in his hand. This wasn't just a forgotten accident. This was unfinished business. Mac sat behind the wheel of his Buick, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the empty road ahead. His heart was still pounding, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. The kid at Anderson Airfield had been scared out of his mind, and for good reason. Reeves knew someone was sniffing around. That meant Mac didn't have much time. He unfolded the crumpled flight log from his pocket, smoothing it against the dashboard. Flight Z91, classified. His name, written in fading ink, was proof that his past hadn't been erased entirely. Someone had tried to bury it, but they hadn't done a good enough job. Mac exhaled through his nose. If there was one thing he knew about men like Reeves, it was that they didn't take risks lightly. If Reeves knew Mac was digging, he wouldn't wait. He'd make his move first, and that meant Mac had to be faster. He reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a battered address book. Most of the names inside were ghosts of another life, but one still mattered. Elias Novak. Mac hesitated for only a second before flipping his headlights on and pulling onto the road. The Eagle's Nest was quieter than before. The evening crowd thinned to just a few old-timers nursing their drinks. The jukebox hummed softly, filling the silence with an old country tune. Eli was behind the bar, wiping a glass when Mac stepped in. His eyes flicked up, wary but unsurprised. "You look like hell," Eli muttered. Mac dropped the flight log onto the counter. "You knew." Eli's hand stilled. His face didn't change, but Mac saw the tension in his shoulders. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eli said evenly. Mac exhaled sharply. "Cut the crap. You knew my flight was classified. You knew they were covering it up." He jabbed a finger at the paper. "And you let me walk away thinking it was just bad luck." Eli set the glass down, rubbing a hand over his face. "I didn't let you walk away, Mac. You barely made it out alive." Mac's jaw tightened. "You should have told me." "You think that would have changed anything?" Eli snapped, leaning in. "You think if I'd told you back then, you'd still be breathing right now?" Mac didn't answer. Eli sighed, shaking his head. "Listen, I didn't lie to you. I just didn't tell you everything. I thought it was over. But if Reeves knows you're looking—" He trailed off, rubbing his temples. "Damn it, Mac. You should have stayed buried." Mac leaned forward. "Tell me what I need to know." Eli hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a slow, practiced motion. "You remember that flight? The one before the crash?" Mac's stomach clenched. "Yeah." Eli exhaled smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling. "That wasn't just a test flight, Mac. That plane, it wasn't supposed to work." Mac frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Eli glanced around, then lowered his voice. "They were testing something, a propulsion system way ahead of its time. But it was unstable. The first batch of pilots who flew those tests, they never came back." Mac's fingers tightened around his glass. "You're telling me they knew it was a death sentence?" Eli nodded grimly. "And they sent you up anyway, except you survived." Mac sat back, his pulse roaring in his ears. "They couldn't risk you talking," Eli continued. "That's why Reeves made sure you disappeared. He got what he wanted. A clean slate. No loose ends." Mac swallowed hard. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "What else?" Eli hesitated. "There's one more thing, but you're not going to like it." Mac met his gaze. "I haven't liked any of this so far." Eli sighed. "That flight? It wasn't Reeves's idea. He was taking orders from someone higher up." Mac's stomach dropped. "Who?" Eli hesitated. "Aerospace contractors, the kind that don't put their names on things. And they're still out there, Mac. Still working, still covering their tracks." Mac ran a hand over his face. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. "They tried to kill me once," he murmured. "They'll try again." Eli crushed his cigarette in the ashtray. "Yeah, and this time, they won't miss." Mac exhaled slowly. He had spent years living in the wreckage of his past, telling himself it was over, But it wasn't. And now he had a choice. Walk away. Pretend none of this ever happened. Or see it through to the end. Mac looked down at the flight log, his name still there. Proof that he had once mattered. Then he looked at Eli. I need to find Reeves. Eli didn't argue this time. He just sighed. Then we better move fast. Mac sat in the passenger seat of Eli's old pickup truck, the city lights blurring into streaks as they sped down the highway. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, but his mind was clear. For the first time in decades, he knew exactly where he needed to go. Reeves, the man who had stolen his future, the man who had built his empire on the bones of pilots like Mac, men who had been written off as accidents, as failures. But Mac was still here, and now he was coming for answers. Eli drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The air between them was thick, filled with things neither of them had the energy to say. Finally, Mac broke the silence. You know where he is? Eli nodded. Yeah, he's got a house in Pasadena. Big place. Private. Security all over it. He hesitated. Mac, this guy ain't just some retired officer. He's deep in the defense industry now. Powerful people still listen when he speaks. Mac's jaw tightened. He had figured as much. And what about his old connections? Mac asked. Still got people willing to clean up his mess? Eli let out a dry laugh. More than a few. And if he even suspects you're coming, he'll make sure you don't get within 100 feet of that house. Mac leaned back, staring out the window. Then we don't go through the front door. Eli glanced at him. You got a plan? Or you just winging it like the old days? Mac exhaled, rubbing his fingers over his knee. We start with the people around him. Find the weak link. Eli didn't argue. Instead, he took an exit, pulling off onto a smaller road lined with old warehouses and dimly lit bars. He parked near a rundown diner, the neon sign flickering above the entrance. You remember Frank Barlow? Eli asked. Mac frowned. Yeah, he was part of the program. Worked logistics. Eli nodded. Now he works for Wendell Aerospace. Word is, he's still close to Reeves. Mac studied the diner through the windshield. A few trucks were parked outside, their drivers lingering over late-night coffee. You sure he's here? He comes here every Wednesday night, Eli said. Gets the same meal, drinks too much, talks a little too loud. Mac didn't waste another second. He pushed the door open and stepped out, the cool night air settling against his skin. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease. The booths were mostly empty, except for one near the back, where a man sat hunched over a plate of half-eaten steak. Frank Barlow. His hair had thinned, his frame had softened with age, but Mac recognized him immediately. The man was muttering to himself, nursing a whiskey as he scrolled through a folder of documents. Mac walked over, sliding into the booth across from him. Frank didn't look up right away, but when he did, his eyes widened in shock. Mac Gaines, he whispered, his grip tightening around his glass. Jesus, I thought you were dead. Mac didn't smile. I get that a lot. Frank swallowed hard, glancing around the diner as if expecting someone to burst in. You shouldn't be here, he muttered. You don't know what you're walking into. Mac folded his hands on the table. That's why I need you to tell me. Frank shook his head. You don't get it, Mac. This isn't just Reeves anymore. He's got backing, government contracts, corporate deals. You think they'll let you walk in and blow everything up? Mac leaned in. I don't care who he works for. I just want the truth. Frank hesitated. His fingers twitched against the rim of his glass. For a moment, he looked like a man at war with himself. Then finally, he exhaled. There's a file, he said quietly. A report on your crash, the real one. Reeves had it buried, but it still exists. Mac's pulse quickened. Where? Frank lowered his voice. Wendell Aerospace keeps classified archives in a facility outside Palm Springs. High security, but if you get in, you'll find what you're looking for. Mac sat back, considering. A direct confrontation with Reeves wouldn't work. But getting that file, that was something he could do. One more thing, Mac said. Does Reeves know I'm looking for him? Frank hesitated. Then slowly, he nodded. He knows. Mac met his gaze. Then I better move fast. Frank looked like he wanted to say more, But he didn't. Instead, he just shook his head and took another sip of whiskey. Max stood, sliding out of the booth. As he stepped outside, Eli was waiting by the truck. "Well?" Eli asked. "We're going to Palm Springs," Max said. Eli let out a long sigh. "Of course we are." Mac pulled open the door, glancing back at the diner one last time. If Reeves knew he was coming, then this wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about finishing what had started all those years ago. The desert stretched wide and empty as Mac and Eli drove toward Palm Springs. The highway was quiet, the stars above clear and sharp against the dark sky. Mac watched the road ahead, but his mind was already inside Wendell Aerospace's classified facility, running through the possibilities. "You sure about this?" Eli asked, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. "No," Mac admitted, "but it's the only way." Eli shook his head. "You ever stop to think we might be walking straight into a trap?" Mac let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Eli shot him a look but didn't argue. They reached Palm Springs just past midnight, pulling onto a side road that led toward the industrial outskirts of the city. Wendell Aerospace's facility sat at the edge of a private airstrip. 3 hangars, a security checkpoint, and a perimeter fence topped with razor wire. Max studied it from a distance, crouched beside Eli's truck with binoculars. "Looks tight," Eli murmured. "Guards at the main gate, another 2 patrolling near the loading docks. Probably cameras, motion sensors, the whole deal." Mac nodded. "Yeah, but that means they're focused on the front. We go in from the side." Eli exhaled. "Why do I feel like you've done this before?" Mac didn't answer. He just checked the pistol tucked into his waistband and started moving. The air was cool, the desert wind kicking up dust as they kept low, creeping toward the fence. A small maintenance shed sat at the edge of the property, its back wall close to the perimeter. Mac motioned for Eli to follow. They reached the shed undetected, flattening against the metal wall. Mac reached into his jacket, pulling out a pair of wire cutters. "You always carry those?" Eli whispered. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to," Mac muttered. With careful precision, he clipped a small section of the fence, just enough for them to slip through. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as they approached the nearest hangar. A security camera rotated overhead. Mac waited until it turned away, then made his move, reaching the hangar door and testing the handle. Locked. He glanced at Eli. "You still got that crowbar in your truck?" Eli sighed, pulling it from his jacket. "Remind me why I let you talk me into this." Max smirked and jammed the crowbar into the door's edge, applying just enough pressure to force the lock. The latch gave with a quiet pop, and they slipped inside. The air smelled of metal and jet fuel. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, next to stacks of old equipment covered in dust. The space was vast, but Mac knew exactly what he was looking for. "The archive room should be near the back," he whispered. They moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. Mac reached a locked filing cabinet and started searching for a way in when Eli tapped his shoulder. Mac, we got a problem." Mac turned. Standing at the entrance was a guard, tall, built, and very clearly armed. The man's hand went for his holster, but Mac was faster. He lunged, slamming into the guard and forcing him against the wall. They struggled, knocking over a metal chair, the sound echoing through the hangar. Eli grabbed the crowbar, raising it as the guard fought to break free. Mac used the moment to twist the gun from his grip, tossing it across the room. "Don't move," Mac growled. The guard froze, breathing hard. Eli stepped forward. "Now listen here, friend. We're just looking for a few old files. You let us be, we let you be. Sound fair?" The guard hesitated, then nodded. Mac held his gaze. "Where are the classified reports?" The guard swallowed. "Storage room. Last cabinet on the right." Mac gestured for Eli to keep an eye on him, then moved quickly. The storage room was locked, but he didn't have time to be careful. He yanked the handle hard, breaking it loose. Inside, rows of cabinets stood against the walls. He scanned the labels until he found it. Z-91, Flight Incident Report. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled the file. He opened it, eyes scanning the pages. And then, a chill ran down his spine. His name was there. His flight. But the official cause of the crash wasn't a technical failure. It wasn't pilot error. It was listed as intentional failure due to classified experimental propulsion testing. They had planned for the plane to crash. They had expected him to die. And below that, a signature, Colton Reeves. Mac's fingers curled into fists. Behind him, Eli's voice cut through the silence. Mac, we need to go. Now. Mac turned. Two more guards had entered the hangar. One was already raising his radio. We're compromised, Eli hissed. Mac shoved the file into his jacket. Run! They bolted for the exit, the alarm blaring behind them. Shots rang out, hitting metal as they ducked behind a stack of crates. Eli cursed. You said this would be quiet. Change of plans, Mac muttered, yanking open a side door. Move! They ran across the lot, headlights flashing in the distance. More guards were coming. Eli's truck was just ahead. They sprinted for it, diving inside as Eli turned the key. The engine roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as they sped toward the gate. A guard tried to block their path. Eli didn't slow down. The truck burst through the fence, metal twisting, sparks flying. And just like that, they were gone. Mac sat back, his breath heavy. His fingers tightened around the stolen file. They had what they came for. But now they had the full attention of a man who didn't forgive loose ends. The desert air roared past the open windows of Eli's truck as they sped down the empty highway. Max sat in the passenger seat, gripping the stolen file like it might disappear if he let go. His breath was steady, but his pulse was hammering against his ribs. Eli glanced at him. You gonna open that thing or just stare at it? Mac exhaled, flipping through the pages again. He'd already seen the most damning piece, the confirmation that his crash had been planned. But there had to be more. And there was. Handwritten notes in the margins, mentions of Project Zeta, names of other test pilots, men who had flown before him, men who had all disappeared. Mac's stomach twisted. Eli, look at this. Eli kept one hand on the wheel, leaning over to glance at the paper. Those names mean something to you? Mac nodded slowly. They were in my training group, some of the best pilots I ever knew. Every one of them flew test flights like mine. He flipped the page. And every one of them died in accidents. Eli let out a low whistle. Jesus, they were killing them off one by one. Mac clenched his jaw. And I was supposed to be next. Eli drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Well, guess you really pissed him off by surviving, huh? Mac didn't answer. He was thinking about Reeves, about the man who had orchestrated all of this, the man who had stolen his future. Eli must have read his mind because he sighed and said, All right, what's the plan, Mac? We got the file, but we also just pissed off one of the most powerful men in the damn defense industry. And I don't know about you, but I like my head where it is. Mac rubbed a hand over his face. He had spent years avoiding this fight, convincing himself there was nothing left to uncover. But now he had proof. Now he had a reason to finish what had started decades ago. We need to find someone who'll listen, Mac said. A reporter, maybe. Someone who can put this out in the open before Reeves buries it again. Eli scoffed. Yeah, sure. And in the meantime, you think he's just going to sit around and let us do that? As if to answer the question, the headlights of a black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror. Eli cursed under his breath. Tell me that's just some guy heading home late. Mac didn't even look. It's not. The SUV gained on them fast. Too fast. Then just as Mac braced himself, the first shot rang out. The back window of the truck exploded into shards, glass raining down over the seats. God damn it! Eli swerved, gripping the wheel tight. You could have warned me we'd be dodging bullets tonight. Mac twisted around, his instincts sharp as ever. Two men in the SUV, one driving, the other leaning out the passenger window with a pistol. Mac grabbed the gun from his waistband and fired back. His shot missed, but it was enough to make the gunman flinch. Eli jerked the wheel, pulling the truck off the highway onto a dirt road. The tires skidded, kicking up dust and gravel. Mac turned back. They're still coming. Of course they are. Eli gritted his teeth, scanning ahead. Hold on. Mac barely had time to brace before the truck plowed through an old wire fence, crashing onto an abandoned construction site. The SUV followed, bouncing over the rough terrain. Eli spun the wheel, dodging piles of scrap metal and half-built structures. The truck fishtailed, barely missing a stack of concrete blocks. Mac leaned out the window, gun raised. The SUV swerved to avoid a deep ditch, giving him a clear shot. He pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the driver's side window. The SUV veered hard, tires screeching. Then suddenly, it flipped. The vehicle twisted midair before slamming into the dirt, rolling over twice before landing upside down. Silence. Eli kept driving, putting as much distance as possible between them and the wreck. Finally, after a few long seconds, he let out a breath. "Tell me they're not still kicking." Mac looked back. The SUV wasn't moving. No one was climbing out. "Not anytime soon," he muttered. Eli chuckled dryly. "Damn, guess you still got it." Mac exhaled, his grip tightening on the file in his lap. They had just made their first move against Reeves, and he had no doubt the man would retaliate. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was war. The truck rumbled down an empty service road, the engine growling with every bump. Dust clung to the air, swirling in the headlights. The silence between Mac and Eli was thick, heavier than the weight of the stolen file resting in Mac's lap. They had barely gotten out of Palm Springs in one piece. Now, with blood in the water, Reeves wouldn't just send lackeys. He'd come at them full force. Eli let out a long breath. "All right, we got a problem." Mac looked over. "Just one?" Eli ignored the sarcasm. "Reeves knows we're coming. We got no safe house, no backup, and sure as hell no guarantee that any journalist will touch this story without proof stronger than some old file." Mac exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Eli wasn't wrong. The file was enough to prove Reeves had buried his past, but it wouldn't be enough to take him down. They needed more. Eli drummed his fingers on the wheel. "So what's next?" "We head straight for Reeves' house and hope he invites us in for coffee." Mac shook his head. We hit him where it hurts." Eli scoffed. "And where exactly is that?" Mac flipped through the file, searching for something, anything that could give them leverage. And then he found it. A single line buried in the margins, written in hastily scrawled handwriting. Project Zeta funding, redirected to private development. Location, Eagle River, Alaska. Mac's pulse quickened. "Son of a bitch," he murmured. Eli frowned. "What? What is it?" Mac turned the file toward him. "Reeves didn't just cover up my crash. He took the technology we tested and moved it off the books. If we can find out what he's building, we have something concrete to bury him with." Eli gave him a long look. "So let me get this straight. You want us to break into a black site facility in the middle of nowhere? Just to poke around?" Max smirked. "Worked out great last time, didn't it?" Eli groaned. "You're going to get me killed, old man." Mac leaned back against the seat, the hum of the road beneath them. "Not tonight," he muttered. By the time they pulled into a rundown motel outside of Barstow, the adrenaline had finally worn off. The neon vacancy sign flickered, buzzing like a dying light bulb. Eli parked, rubbing his tired eyes. "All right, I'm grabbing a room. We'll lay low for a few hours, then hit the road." Mac nodded, stepping out of the truck. The desert air was cool now, the heat of the day finally relenting. He scanned the parking lot, instincts still sharp. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Eli disappeared into the motel office, leaving Mac alone with his thoughts. He leaned against the hood of the truck, pulling out the old photograph from his wallet, the one of him standing beside his aircraft, back when the world still made sense. He ran his thumb over his name patch, Lieutenant Maverick Gaines. He had spent so many years believing his story had ended in that crash, that his name had been erased, forgotten. But now he had a chance to set things right. Mac tucked the photo away just as Eli returned, tossing him a room key. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "I have a feeling tomorrow's gonna suck." Max smirked but didn't argue. They stepped inside the room. Musty carpet, yellowing wallpaper, a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in a decade. Eli flopped onto the bed without hesitation, kicking off his boots. Max sat at the edge of his own bed, flipping through the file one last time. Every page was a reminder of what had been stolen from him. His career, his name, his future. He clenched his jaw. Not anymore. Mac turned off the lamp and lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't rest. Somewhere out there, Reeves was waiting, and soon Mac would be knocking on his door. The hum of the motel's neon sign buzzed faintly outside, flickering against the thin curtains. Mac sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the classified file in his hands. The weight of it felt heavier now, like holding a live wire. This wasn't just evidence. It was a death sentence if it fell into the wrong hands. Across the room, Eli was already awake, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "We're really doing this, huh?" Mac nodded. "We need to get to Eagle River before Reeves knows we're coming." Eli exhaled, sitting up. "And how exactly do we pull that off? It's not like we can hop on a plane with stolen government secrets in our pockets." Mac tapped a finger against the file. "We drive to Seattle. I know a guy there. Someone who can get us on a cargo flight up north. No questions asked." Eli let out a dry chuckle. "Of course you do," Mac smirked. "Old habits." Eli stood, stretching with a groan. "All right, let's move before someone tracks us down." They packed quickly, shoving their few belongings into duffel bags. Mac tucked the classified documents into the lining of his jacket, making sure they were secure. Every second they lingered felt like an open target on their backs. Eli checked out of the motel while Mac stood by the truck, scanning the lot. The morning was still early, the desert air crisp. Nothing seemed out of place, but Mac's gut told him they weren't alone. He slid into the passenger seat. "Drive casual, but keep an eye on the mirrors." Eli didn't argue. They pulled onto the highway, the engine humming steady. For a few miles, it was just open road. Then in the rearview mirror, a black sedan. Mac's grip tightened. "We've got company." Eli flicked his eyes to the mirror. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough." The sedan stayed back, keeping a steady distance. Mac checked the side mirror. "They're not making a move yet, just tailing." Eli muttered a curse under his breath. "You think Reeves already put the word out?" Mac didn't need to guess. He knew the second we hit that facility in Palm Springs. Eli's fingers flexed on the wheel. "So what do we do?" "Lose them?" Mac thought for a second. "Number, we see what they want." Eli shot him a glance. "You sure about that?" Mac nodded. "They wouldn't be following us if they wanted us dead. Not yet. Let's give them a reason to show their hand." Eli sighed. "Your funeral." He slowed the truck slightly, just enough to force the sedan to react. The car hesitated, then sped up to close the gap. Mac watched as it crept closer. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. Then suddenly, the passenger window rolled down. Mac tensed. A man leaned out, holding a piece of paper. A phone number. Mac exchanged a glance with Eli. "Pull over." Eli muttered another curse but did as told, easing onto the gravel shoulder. The sedan stopped a few yards behind them. Mac stepped out, keeping his hands visible. The other driver did the same, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, his face calm, unreadable. "You've been busy," the man said. Mac didn't answer. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Someone who wants to keep you alive. If you're smart enough to listen." Mac folded his arms. "I'm listening." The man held up the paper. "Call this number. Someone wants to talk." Mac didn't move. "Who?" The man's smile didn't waver. "A friend. Or at least someone who doesn't want Reeves to win." Mac took the paper but didn't look at it. "Why should I trust you?" The man's expression darkened. "Because if I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be standing here." Mac held his gaze. Finally, he nodded. "We'll be in touch." The man stepped back into the sedan without another word. The car pulled away, disappearing down the highway. Eli let out a long breath. That was weird. Mac looked at the paper in his hand. Just a number. No name. No details. But something told him this was a door he needed to open. "We call," Mac said, climbing back into the truck. Eli sighed. "I hate this plan already." Mac pulled out his phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Maverick Gaines," the voice said. "It's about time we talked." Mac tightened his grip on the phone. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, too controlled to be some random informant. "Who am I talking to?" he asked, keeping his tone even. A brief pause, then, "Someone who has as much to lose as you do if Reeves keeps winning." Eli shot Mac a wary glance from the driver's seat, but he kept quiet. Mac leaned back, eyes fixed on the highway stretching ahead. "You know my name, but I don't know yours." "Names don't matter," the voice replied. "What matters is that you're getting too close to something bigger than just your crash, and I can help you get what you need." Mac let out a slow breath. He'd been in this game long enough to recognize a setup when he heard one. "You work for Reeves?" A sharp exhale, almost like a laugh. "If I did, we wouldn't be having this conversation." That didn't exactly ease Mac's suspicions. "Then why help me?" he pressed. "What's in it for you?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Let's just say, Reeves and I have unfinished business. You're not the only one he's burned, and I have information that could make your next move a hell of a lot easier, if you're willing to listen." Mac glanced at Eli, who shook his head like this was the worst idea in the world. Mac didn't disagree, but he also knew this was the first real lead they'd had since Palm Springs. "Talk," Mac said. The voice didn't hesitate. "You're heading to Eagle River. You're looking for Project Zeta." Mac didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. "You won't find what you're looking for," the voice continued. "Not unless you know where to look. That facility, it's a shell, a front. The real data, the real records, they're not there anymore." Mac frowned. "Then where are they?" "Anchorage," the voice said. "Wendell Aerospace's private archives. Locked away, off the books under tight security. But if you can get inside, you'll find everything you need." Mac considered that. If the files were there, it made sense. Reeves wouldn't keep his secrets in some abandoned airfield. He'd keep them close. But that also meant breaking into a corporate stronghold. "This isn't a free favor, is it?" Mac asked. The voice was quiet for a beat. Then, "Number. I need something from you, too." Mac clenched his jaw. "Of course you do. You get inside that archive," the voice continued. "You're going to find more than just Project Zeta. Reeves has been covering up more than failed test flights. He's been running defense contracts that don't officially exist. I need proof of that." Mac let out a dry chuckle. "So this is personal for you?" "You could say that." Mac weighed his options. He didn't trust this guy, but trust wasn't a luxury he had right now. "You got a name, or am I just supposed to call you Mystery Voice?" A pause, then, "Call me Hawk." Eli let out a groan. "Oh, come on, that is such a fake name." Mac ignored him. "All right, Hawk, we get you what you want. You help us. That the deal?" "It is," Mac exhaled. "Then tell me how to break into Wendell's archives." The voice on the other end was steady. "I thought you'd never ask." The sun was starting to rise by the time Mac and Eli pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Sacramento. The call had ended 30 minutes ago, and neither of them had spoken since. Eli pumped gas while Mac leaned against the truck, flipping through the notes he'd scribbled from Hawk's intel. "Anchorage, huh?" Eli muttered, slamming the gas cap shut. "I gotta say, if we're breaking into a high-security archive, I kinda wish we were doing it somewhere warmer." Mac smirked. "Wouldn't be as fun." Eli rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, remind me to thank you when we're freezing our asses off in the middle of a corporate heist." Mac looked down at his notes. Anchorage, Wendell Aerospace, the final piece of the puzzle. He tucked the papers into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the old flight report, the one that had started all of this. They weren't just chasing ghosts anymore. They were chasing the man who had tried to bury them. And this time, Mac wasn't going to let Reeves win. The wind howled as the plane touched down in Anchorage, its wheels skidding slightly against the frost-covered tarmac. Mac adjusted his collar, glancing out the window at the endless white stretching beyond the runway. Even after all these years, he had never gotten used to the cold. Eli let out a low whistle beside him. "Hell of a place to keep secrets," he muttered, watching as airport workers bundled in thick coats moved between cargo planes. Mac nodded. Exactly why Reeves picked it. They had left Seattle hours ago on a cargo flight arranged by Hawk's contact, a pilot who asked no questions, just handed them a pair of duffel bags and told them to watch their backs out there. Now, standing in a nearly deserted terminal, They had one goal: infiltrate Wendell Aerospace's private archives and get the proof they needed. Mac adjusted the strap of his bag. "We need transport." Eli stretched, cracking his neck. "Let me guess. You also got a guy in Alaska?" Mac smirked. "Something like that." They found Jimmy Cross in a dingy bar just off the main road. He was exactly how Mac remembered him. Grizzled, beer in hand, eyes sharp despite his years. "Well, I'll be damned," Jimmy muttered, setting down his glass as Mac and Eli slid into the booth. "Thought you were dead, Gaines." "Not yet," Mac said. Jimmy studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, what do you need?" Mac didn't waste time. "A car, an unregistered phone, and anything you can tell me about Wendell's Anchorage facility." Jimmy exhaled through his nose. "Jesus, you don't ask for much, huh?" Eli leaned in. "Would it help if we said, please?" Jimmy ignored him, reaching for his drink. "Wendell's got their archive inside a private hangar near the port. Security's tight. Armed guards, surveillance, the whole deal." Mac already figured as much. "How do we get in?" Jimmy smirked. "Depends. You feel like dressing up?" Mac raised an eyebrow. Jimmy leaned closer. "There's a shipment coming in tonight. Military-grade parts, supposedly. Wendell's got a contract with the feds, and they'll be checking every crate that comes through those gates." Eli groaned. "Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." Mac smirked. "We stow away in the shipment." Eli dropped his head into his hands. "I hate this plan." Jimmy chuckled. "Smart move, though. They won't be looking inside until after everything's inside the secured area." Mac nodded. "And once we're in, we find the archive room and get the files." Jimmy exhaled. "Yeah, if you're lucky," Eli huffed. "Mac's never been lucky, just too stubborn to die." Mac ignored him, turning back to Jimmy. "Can you get us in?" Jimmy downed the last of his beer. "I can get you near it. The rest is on you." Mac extended a hand. Jimmy shook it, firm and steady. "Meet me at the docks in 4 hours," Jimmy said. "And wear something warm for God's sake. You'll freeze before you even make it to the damn files." The docks were quiet when they arrived, the air thick with the smell of salt and engine oil. Crates were being offloaded from a massive cargo ship, forklifts moving between shipping containers. Jimmy met them near a stack of wooden crates labeled aviation parts, in bold lettering. "All right, boys, in you go." Eli stared at the crate, then back at Mac. "This is your worst idea yet," Mac smirked. "That's a bold statement." With a reluctant sigh, Eli climbed in first, followed by Mac. Jimmy secured the lid, knocking twice. "Next stop, Wendell Aerospace," he muttered. The forklift roared to life, lifting their crate. Inside the tight space, Mac focused on his breathing, ignoring the cramped walls. He had flown experimental jets at Mach 3, but this was worse. Eli shifted beside him. "I swear, if we die in a damn shipping crate, I'm haunting you." Mac just smiled in the dark. "Hold that thought. We're not in yet." The crate moved, lifted onto a truck. The vibrations told Mac they were in motion. This was the hard part, the waiting. Then after what felt like an eternity, the truck came to a stop. Voices outside. The sound of a clipboard being checked. A guard's voice. "All clear. Move it inside." The truck lurched forward again. Mac exhaled slowly. They were in. Now they just had to make it out alive. The crate landed with a heavy thud, shaking Mac and Eli inside their cramped hiding spot. Outside, the sounds of forklifts and machinery filled the air, the voices of workers shouting over the noise. They had made it inside Wendell Aerospace's Anchorage facility. Now they just had to get out. Eli muttered in the dark. "You know, I've had some bad ideas in my life. But this is top 5. Mac smirked. "Then you've been living safe." Before Eli could respond, the crate jolted again, then stillness. The forklift had placed them inside the storage area. A few muffled voices drifted past, then footsteps faded down the corridor. Mac listened for a full minute before moving. He shifted, pressing against the wooden panel of the crate, feeling for the weak points. He had spent years working around aircraft cargo. He knew how these things were built. A well-placed kick, crack. Eli tensed. "Tell me that was intentional?" Max smirked in the dark. You'd be surprised how often that's true. He pushed again, and the panel gave way, splintering just enough for them to slip through. They crawled out carefully, crouching behind a stack of similar crates, scanning their surroundings. Rows of shipping containers lined the facility's massive hangar, each marked with government contract numbers. The walls were lined with security cameras, their red lights blinking lazily. A few armed guards patrolled near the entrance. Eli exhaled. Yeah, tight security. Real fun place you picked, Mac. Mac ignored him. Hawk said the archives are in the administrative wing, past the loading bay. That's where we go. Eli shook his head. Right. Just a quick stroll through a secured aerospace facility. No big deal. They moved swiftly, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The industrial space was filled with enough cover to keep them hidden, but they had to be fast. Max spotted a maintenance door along the far wall. There, he whispered. Eli followed, keeping his footsteps light. When they reached the door, Mac tested the handle. Locked. Eli sighed. Of course! Mac pulled out a small screwdriver from his jacket. Give me 30 seconds. Eli rolled his eyes. Breaking and entering's a real useful skill set you got there, old man. Mac didn't look up. Life teaches you things. The lock clicked. The door swung open. They slipped inside, the air shifting from industrial cold to a quieter, office-like environment. The administrative wing, dim lights illuminated a row of metal filing cabinets, the walls lined with shelves stacked with binders and hard drives. Max spotted a locked vault door at the far end of the room. There, he murmured. Eli hesitated. And I'm guessing we don't have the key? Max scanned the room. Number, but someone here does. Voices echoed from down the hall. Two security personnel approaching. Mac grabbed Eli, yanking him behind a row of metal cabinets just as the guards entered. They were talking in low voices. One of them, a tall guy with a security badge clipped to his belt, chuckled at something. You see the new clearance levels they rolled out, one of them muttered. Messed up. I had to get fingerprinted just to access the archives this morning. Mac and Eli exchanged a glance. The other guard sighed. Yeah, well, I'm just here to do my shift and get paid. You coming to poker night tomorrow? They moved toward a break room door, still chatting. As soon as the door shut behind them, Mac turned to Eli. We need that guy's key card and fingerprint. Eli rubbed his temples. I hate that I know where this is going. 5 minutes later, the guard was unconscious on the floor, propped against the break room counter. Eli adjusted his sleeves. You know, I really thought we could do this without knocking someone out. Mac didn't respond. He pulled the key card from the guy's belt and grabbed a roll of adhesive tape from a nearby supply cart. Eli raised an eyebrow. Really? Tape? Max smirked. You ever see how they lift fingerprints? Eli sighed. Yeah, you're real clever. Just hurry up. Mac pressed the tape to the guard's finger, then carefully transferred the print onto the biometric scanner next to the vault door. Beep. Access granted. Eli blinked. I swear to God, if I wasn't here to see that, I wouldn't believe it. Mac pushed the door open. Welcome to the vault. Inside, the air was cool, almost sterile. Rows of classified files lined the room, each cabinet locked and labeled with cryptic project names. A few computers sat at a secured terminal in the center. Max scanned the files, running his fingers along the metal cabinets. Then he saw it. Project Zeta. His stomach tightened. He pulled the drawer open, flipping through the contents. Dozens of documents, flight logs, internal memos. Mac grabbed as much as he could, stuffing them into his bag. Then he saw a sealed envelope marked Top Secret, Do Not Distribute. He ripped it open. Inside was a photograph. Mac's breath hitched. It was a picture of him, from the day of his crash, and standing next to him, shaking hands with a man in a suit, Colton Reeves. Mac's grip tightened around the photo. Eli, noticing his expression, peered over his shoulder. Mac, what the hell is that? Mac turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, was a handwritten note. Initiate Phase 2. Gains is expendable. Eli exhaled sharply. Jesus, they didn't just want you gone. They planned it from the start. Mac clenched his jaw. I was never meant to survive. Then, alarms blared. Red emergency lights flashed. A voice echoed over the intercom. Unauthorized access detected. Security lockdown initiated, Eli swore. Time to go. Max stuffed the last of the files into his bag. Follow me. They ran. Through the door, down the hall. Footsteps pounded from both ends of the corridor. Guards moving in fast. Mac and Eli darted through a side door, emerging into the loading bay. A large freight truck sat idling near the entrance. Eli pointed. That's our way out. Mac didn't hesitate. They sprinted for it just as guards rounded the corner, guns drawn. Shots rang out, sparking against metal. Mac jumped onto the back of the truck, reaching down to haul Eli up. The driver, startled, turned in his seat. Hey! Mac pointed his gun. Drive! Now! The driver didn't argue. The truck lurched forward, speeding through the security gate just as it slammed shut behind them. Eli collapsed against the cargo wall, breathing hard. I swear to God, if I ever make it out of this alive, I'm retiring. Mac didn't respond. He stared down at the photograph in his hands. The proof they needed was in this file. And now? Reeves would stop at nothing to erase them for good. The freight truck rumbled down the icy highway, its wheels skidding slightly as it sped away from Wendell Aerospace's facility. Mac sat in the back, gripping the file so tightly his knuckles turned white. The stolen documents were everything he had been searching for. Proof that Reeves had orchestrated the crash. Proof that Project Zeta had been more than a failed experiment. Proof that Mac had been meant to die. Eli sat beside him, still catching his breath. So what now? Mac stared at the faded photograph in his hands, his younger self, shaking hands with Colton Reeves. The handwritten note on the back sent a chill through him. Initiate Phase 2. Gaines is expendable. Mac exhaled, folding the photo carefully. We need to get this to someone who can actually use it. Eli let out a dry laugh. Yeah? And who the hell is that? You think any journalist is going to run this story without hard proof? Half the government's probably in on it. Mac knew Eli was right. This wasn't just about exposing a cover-up. It was about going up against the kind of men who built cover-ups for a living. But he also knew one thing for sure. If they didn't act fast, Reeves would come for them next. Eli watched him, frowning. You're thinking something. I don't like when you think. Mac pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. There weren't many numbers in there, and most of them belonged to ghosts from another life. But there was one name that still mattered. Nina Carter. Eli blinked. The reporter? You think she'll touch this? Mac nodded. She doesn't scare easy, and she hates Reeves almost as much as I do. Eli sighed. Fine, but if this gets us killed, I'm blaming you. Mac smirked. You already do. He hit dial. They met Nina in a rundown diner just outside Anchorage, a place where no one asked questions, and the coffee tasted like burnt rubber. She was already there when they walked in, sitting in a corner booth, stirring a spoon absently through a half-empty cup. She looked up as they approached, her sharp eyes scanning them both. Took you long enough. Max slid into the booth across from her, setting the stolen file down between them. Had to pick up a souvenir. Nina raised an eyebrow. Tell me this is good. Mac opened the file, laying out the evidence piece by piece. Nina's expression hardened as she scanned the documents, her fingers tightening around the edges. She picked up the photograph, turning it over to read the note on the back. Then she cursed. Jesus Christ. Eli leaned back in the booth, stretching. Yeah, that was my reaction too. Nina exhaled sharply. This is everything. The cover-up, the test pilots they eliminated, the defense contracts that never should have existed. She shook her head. Reeves buried all of this. If this goes public, he'll come after us, Mac finished. Nina nodded. Yeah, and not with a lawsuit. Mac leaned forward. We need to move fast. Can you get this out? Nina hesitated. I can try, but we need a second source, something to back it up. If this file just appears, the people protecting Reeves will call it a forgery. Mac clenched his jaw. Then we find someone who was there, Eli scoffed. Oh, sure. Let's just call up one of Reeves' old buddies and ask real nicely if they'd like to betray a powerful war criminal. Mac ignored him, flipping through the files until he found what he was looking for. A list of names, the men who had been assigned to Project Zeta. Most of them were dead, except one, Frank Barlow. Mac exhaled. He's still alive. Nina frowned. Who? Barlow was in logistics, Mac said. He moved the test pilots between bases. If anyone knew what Reeves was doing behind closed doors, it was him. Nina's expression darkened. And you think he'll talk? Mac's fingers tightened around the file. He doesn't have a choice. They found Frank Barlow in a small, rundown house on the outskirts of Anchorage. The front yard was overgrown, the windows fogged from years of neglect. A single porch light flickered weakly as Mac knocked on the door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the sound of locks clicking. The door cracked open, and a tired, wary face peered out. Frank had aged since Mac last saw him, his hair thinner, his skin lined with years of regret. The moment he saw Mac, his eyes widened. No, you need to leave. Mac pushed the door open before Frank could shut it. We need to talk. Frank shook his head. I don't have anything to say. You do, Mac said, stepping inside. And you know it. Frank exhaled heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. You don't understand. They still watch me. If I talk, they'll come for you, Mac finished. They'll come for us, too. But here's the thing, Frank. You're already on their list. You think they're gonna let you sit here and rot in peace? You know too much. Frank swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. Nina stepped forward, softer than Mac. We can protect you, but we need your story. The truth. Frank let out a ragged breath. You don't get it. Reeves, he didn't just cover it up. He kept it going. Mac's stomach turned. What are you talking about? Frank closed his eyes. Project Zeta wasn't abandoned after your crash. It was expanded. New pilots, new testing sites, all off the books. And the worst part? He looked at them, fear etched deep into his face. They're still flying. Mac's breath caught. Still, Nina whispered. Frank nodded. They moved it out of the country. New testing fields. New pilots who don't even know what they're flying. His voice dropped. Some of them don't come back. Mac's hands curled into fists. Reeves hadn't just erased the past. He had built something worse. Eli let out a low curse. Well, that just made this a hell of a lot bigger. Mac turned to Nina. You still want to publish this story? She looked pale, but she nodded. Now more than ever. Frank exhaled shakily. You don't understand. Once you do this, there's no going back. Mac held his gaze. I was never going back. The room was silent. Then finally Frank nodded. I'll talk, he said. Outside in the darkness beyond the porch, a black SUV sat idling at the end of the road, waiting, watching. And the moment Frank Barlow opened his mouth, the war truly began. Frank sat at his kitchen table, hands trembling as he flipped through the stolen file Mac had laid out in front of him. His eyes darted across the documents, his breathing shallow. This is bad, he whispered. Worse than I thought. Mac leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Then start talking. Frank looked up, his face pale under the dim kitchen light. You don't get it. Reeves didn't just bury this. He built an entire network to keep it hidden. He used private contractors, fake shell companies, even off-the-books military testing fields overseas. Nina had her recorder running, her notepad open. Where? Where is this happening? Frank hesitated. Then, in a barely audible voice, Kazakhstan. Remote airfields in the desert. They're testing things they don't want the world to see. Eli let out a low whistle. Jesus, and these poor bastards flying for them. They don't even know? Frank shook his head. They recruit young, desperate guys. Tell them they're part of some elite training program. But in reality, they're guinea pigs, just like Mac was supposed to be. Mac's fist clenched at his sides. And Reeves is still running this? Frank nodded. Yeah, but he's not the only one anymore. He's got people backing him. Politicians, defense contractors, people who have a lot to lose if this comes out. Nina scribbled furiously in her notebook. Then we need to go public. The story needs to break before Reeves realizes how much we have. Frank swallowed hard. You don't understand. The second this story runs, they'll come after me. And after you. Mac's voice was calm but firm. They already are. Frank stared at him, searching for a way out, but there wasn't one. Finally, he exhaled. All right, I'll testify. I'll give you everything I know. Nina nodded. I can get this published. I have contacts at the Guardian Times. If we move fast, we can get it out before they try to silence us. Mac gave her a sharp look. How fast? Tonight. The black SUV was still there when they stepped onto the porch, its headlights off, engine humming softly in the distance. Mac scanned the street, every nerve on edge. We need to move. Eli nudged Frank. You got a back door? Frank nodded. Yeah, leads to the alley. Mac gestured for everyone to follow. They moved quickly, keeping low. The alley behind Frank's house was narrow, flanked by tall fences and overgrown weeds. Nina pulled out her phone. I'm calling my editor. We get this to him now. She pressed the phone to her ear. Then her face went pale. What? Mac demanded. She turned the phone around, showing the no service message on the screen. Eli muttered a curse. They're jamming us. A voice echoed from the alley entrance. Going somewhere? Mac spun, gun already drawn. 4 men, dressed in dark suits, moving with precision, not amateurs. And leading them was a face Mac hadn't seen in decades. Colton Reeves. The man looked older, but not weaker. His suit was crisp, his hair silver at the edges, but his eyes still held the same cold calculation. He stepped forward, hands casually in his pockets. It's been a long time, Gaines, Reeves said smoothly. I almost didn't believe it when I heard you were still alive. Mac didn't lower his gun. Sorry to disappoint, Reeves smirked. Not at all. In fact, I find it rather poetic. After all these years, you come crawling back, looking for justice. He chuckled. Or is this just about revenge? Mac's grip tightened. I don't need revenge, Reeves. I need the truth. Reeves tilted his head. And what do you think happens if you get it? You think exposing me changes anything? Mac took a step forward. It changes everything. Reeves sighed, almost amused. You always were the idealist. He nodded toward Frank. And what about him? You really think we'll let a liability like Barlow walk away from this? Frank paled, his breath coming faster. Mac glanced at Nina. Get him out of here. Nina hesitated. Mac? Go. Eli pulled Frank back toward the alley's exit. The moment they moved, Reeves raised a hand. His men pulled their guns. Mac fired first. The alley erupted in chaos, gunfire flashing in the dark, bullets ricocheting off brick. Mac took cover behind a dumpster, squeezing off shots as Reeves's men advanced. Nina and Eli dragged Frank toward the back gate, pushing through just as a bullet shattered the wood behind them. Reeves didn't move. He just stood there watching, smiling. Mac ducked as another shot whizzed past his ear. He fired again, hitting one of the men in the shoulder. The guy dropped his gun, cursing. Reeves finally spoke. You're wasting your time, Mac. You think the world cares about a handful of dead pilots? You think the government is going to stop because of a newspaper article? Mac didn't hesitate. He turned, firing straight at Reeves. But before the bullet could hit, one of his men pulled him back. The shot missed. Reeves let out a quiet laugh. Still got fight in you, I see. He dusted off his sleeve. No matter. This isn't over. Mac's heart pounded. He had a clear shot. But before he could take it, tires screeched at the end of the alley. Nina's car. She leaned out the window, shouting, Mac! We have to go! Mac hesitated, just for a second. But that second was enough. Reeves vanished into the shadows, his men retreating as the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. Mac turned and ran. He jumped into the car just as Nina gunned the engine, tires screeching against the pavement. As they sped away, Mac looked back. Reeves was watching them, standing in the alley, his face unreadable. Nina's hands were shaking on the wheel. Mac, she gasped. What the hell just happened? Mac didn't answer. He just looked down at the photo in his hand. Colton Reeves had planned his death once, and now he would try again. But this time, Mac was ready for him. The car tore down the dark highway, Nina gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles were white. The air inside was thick with tension, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Mac sat in the passenger seat, staring at the photo of himself and Reeves, the same photo that had nearly cost them their lives tonight. Eli from the back seat let out a breath. Well, that went to hell real fast. Nina shot him a glare. No kidding. We just barely got out of there. Frank was slumped beside him, still shaking. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He, he knew. He knew we were coming. Mac exhaled. He's been ahead of us this whole time. Nina glanced at Mac. So what now? We still get this to the press. Mac turned the photo over, rereading the scrawled note on the back. Initiate Phase 2. Gaines is expendable. His own death had been planned, calculated, and if Reeves was still running things, he wasn't done yet. Mac looked up at Nina. We publish everything, she hesitated. And then what? You think the government's just going to roll over because of one article? Mac clenched his jaw. Number. But we forced their hand. We put this story in front of everyone. And if Reeves wants to keep it buried, he'll have to do it in the daylight. Eli muttered. That's assuming we make it that far. The headlights of a black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror. Frank gasped. Oh God, it's them! Mac twisted in his seat. 3 SUVs. All speeding up, Eli swore. Well, I guess they're done playing nice. Nina gritted her teeth. Hold on! She slammed on the gas, the car rocketing forward. The SUVs followed. Mac checked his gun. 1 clip. Not nearly enough. Eli glanced at him. Tell me you got a brilliant idea. Mac's eyes flicked to the road ahead, a side route leading toward the mountains. Take that turn, he shouted. Nina hesitated. That's a damn cliffside road, Mac. Mac didn't blink. Do it. She yanked the wheel, tires screeching as they veered onto the narrow mountain pass. The SUVs followed, kicking up dust and gravel behind them. Eli muttered, This is a really bad plan. Mac rolled down his window, bracing himself. Buy me a few seconds. Nina's eyes widened. What are you? Mac leaned out the window, gun aimed at the first SUV. He squeezed the trigger. 1 shot, 2. The front tire exploded. The SUV swerved hard, spinning out before crashing into the mountainside. 1 down, Mac shouted. Eli whooped. All right, now I'm impressed. But the other 2 SUVs kept coming. One of them pulled up beside them, a man leaning out with a rifle. Mac barely had time to react before a burst of gunfire shattered the side mirror. Frank screamed. Nina cursed. We are not dying like this. Mac grabbed onto the frame of the car and lunged out, firing at the gunman. The shot hit his shoulder, sending him tumbling from the vehicle. The SUV swerved wildly, smashing against the guardrail, then flipping over the edge. Eli whistled. Damn! Mac pulled himself back inside, breathing hard. 1 more left. The last SUV rammed into their bumper, trying to force them off the road. Mac clenched his jaw. Nina, how much farther? Nina checked the road ahead. 5 miles of cliffs, then a bridge. Mac's mind raced. That was their chance. He turned to Eli. You ever jump from a moving car? Eli paled. Mac, no. Mac checked his gun. Then you're about to learn. The bridge loomed ahead, a narrow wooden pass over a deep canyon. Nina gritted her teeth. We hit that thing too fast. We're all dead. Mac nodded. Exactly. That's why we bail before we get there. Eli swore. This is the stupidest thing you've ever... Mac kicked open the passenger door. Eli groaned. Oh, son of a... Now! Mac shouted. They jumped. Mac hit the ground hard, rolling as the car sped toward the bridge. The SUV followed. Too close. Too fast. Then the bridge collapsed. The SUV plunged into the canyon, disappearing into darkness. Mac lay on his back, breathing hard. His ribs screamed in pain, but he was alive. Eli groaned beside him. I hate you, Mac smirked. You're welcome. Nina's car slowed to a stop a few yards ahead. She threw open the door, storming toward them. Are you insane? She shouted. Mac grinned up at her. It worked, didn't it? She threw her hands in the air, muttering curses. Eli just lay in the dirt, shaking his head. Next time, I'm picking the plan. Mac sat up, wincing. Next time, we make sure there isn't one. Because now, it was over. Reeves knew they weren't running anymore. The final battle was coming, and Mac was going to finish this. The sun hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the empty stretch of road where Mac, Nina, and Eli stood. The wreckage of the collapsed bridge smoldered in the canyon below, a stark reminder that their war with Reeves was no longer being fought in the shadows. It was out in the open now. Mac exhaled, rolling his shoulder to work out the soreness from the fall. His ribs ached, his body was running on fumes, but his mind was clear. Reeves had tried to kill them. Again. That meant they were out of time. Eli groaned as he stretched. Okay, so let's review. We have a story that'll ruin one of the most powerful men in the country, a witness who just signed his own death warrant, and a whole army of goons hunting us down. He clapped his hands. Great plan, Mac. Mac smirked. That's not the plan. Eli narrowed his eyes. Oh, good. It gets worse. Mac turned to Nina. You still have a way to get this to your editor. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, shaking it. They jammed us before, but if we can get to a secure location, I can send everything through an encrypted line. Mac nodded. Do it. Get this story out now. Nina hesitated. What about you? Mac's grip tightened around the photo of Reeves and himself, the damning proof of what had been done to him, what had been done to countless pilots before and after him. I'm going to end this, he said. Eli groaned. God, I knew you were going to say that. Nina looked uneasy. Mac, we don't even know where Reeves is. And even if we did... Mac pulled out his phone and held it up. One missed call. From Colton Reeves. Eli blinked. Oh, hell no. He called you? Mac nodded. He knew we'd survive. And he's not done with me yet. Nina frowned. You're saying he wants to talk? Mac smirked. Number, he wants to win. The private airfield outside of Anchorage was quiet. Too quiet. Max stepped onto the tarmac, feeling the cold wind whip against his face. A single jet sat in the middle of the runway, its sleek body glinting under the setting sun. And standing beside it, Colton Reeves. Mac kept his hands loose at his sides, but he knew this was it. There was no backup, no escape plan. It was just the two of them now. Reeves smiled as Mac approached. You always were predictable, Gaines. Mac didn't return the smile. And you always underestimated me. Reeves chuckled. I never underestimated you. I respected you. That's why you were chosen. Mac's jaw tightened. Chosen for what? To be your lab rat? To be erased? Reeves exhaled as if bored. You were part of something bigger than yourself, Mac. You just didn't understand it. And now, you're making the same mistake again. Mac took another step forward. Number. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight back. Reeves sighed. Let's be honest here. Do you really think you can stop this? Do you think the government, the corporations, the machine that runs the world, do you think they'll let your little story change anything? Mac smirked. You do. Reeves' expression flickered for a split second, just enough for Mac to see the truth. Reeves wasn't afraid of losing power. He was afraid of losing control. Mac took another step closer. That's why you're here, isn't it? Not to kill me, not yet. You want me to fold, to back down, to disappear. Again, Reeves's voice dropped lower. I'm offering you an out, Mac. You walk away, you let this die, and I'll make sure you live long enough to enjoy whatever time you have left. Mac chuckled, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? Reeves tilted his head. Mac's smile faded. I was dead once, and I came back. Then he pulled the gun. Reeves moved fast, but Mac was faster. 2 shots, one to the leg, one to the shoulder. Reeves stumbled back, gasping, dropping to one knee. His men, who had been hiding in the shadows, rushed forward. And that's when the police sirens wailed. Mac stepped back as FBI and Anchorage PD vehicles flooded the tarmac, agents spilling out with guns drawn. One of them, a no-nonsense woman in a tactical vest, strode toward them. Nina sends her regards, she said flatly. Max smirked. Reeves laughed, coughing through the pain. You think this changes anything? Mac leaned down. I think it changes everything. The agents hauled Reeves to his feet, slapping cuffs on him. Mac exhaled, finally letting himself breathe. It was over. 2 days later, the Guardian-Times ran the story. The headline read, The Program That Never Existed, The Pilots Who Were Erased. Reeves was finished. The world knew the truth. And Mac, for the first time in decades, his name meant something again. He stood outside a small airfield, watching a plane take off into the sky. Eli stepped up beside him. "So, what now?" Mac smirked. "Now? I go home." Eli chuckled. "You think you still got one of those?" Mac watched the sky. "I do now." And with that, Maverick Gaines walked away, finally free. In the end, the truth always finds a way to rise. No matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how many powerful hands try to keep it hidden. Maverick Gaines was never meant to survive, but he did. And in doing so, he proved that one man's fight for justice can shake even the most unshakable forces. But here's the question. How many other stories like this are still hidden? How many names have been erased from history, waiting for someone to bring them back? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories of resilience, justice, and the fight against the impossible, hit that subscribe button and stay with us for the next one. The truth is always worth uncovering.